So I want to start today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land of which I'm coming from, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. And I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. My name's Stephen Halmarick. I'm the Chief Economist of the bank, and it's really my great pleasure to introduce and chair this session today. So we have with us Matt Gertken. He's the Chief Strategist, Geopolitical and US Policy Strategy at BCA Research. So at BCA Research, he oversees the firm's coverage of market-related geopolitical, political and policy developments across the world. And we really appreciate your time today, Matt, and we look forward to the discussion. And Matt, when we were organising this event, of course, we didn't know that geopolitical events would really be to the fore significantly in the last few days, unfortunately, with the tragic events in Israel. So welcome and thank you for joining us today. And perhaps that's the best place to start in terms of events and developments in the Middle East.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. It's very good to be with you all, and thank you for having me. Yeah, so I think we should start with the Middle East. The key context for the attacks that occurred is geopolitical, meaning that it's big picture. It involves the tectonics of the region. Iran is a mountainous country with 80 million people, intelligent. They are capable of dominating the region. If you can imagine a world in which the United States washes its hands of the Middle East and goes away, it's quite possible that Iran, with nuclear weapons backed by Russia and China, could become the regional hegemon. And American policy has constantly counterbalanced Iran precisely because the U.S. grand strategy forbids the formation of regional empires, because regional empires can then cause major problems for the United States on a global level. And that's why we see the U.S. trying to contain Russia. That's why we see the U.S. try to contain China. That's why we see the U.S. try to contain Iran. Now, the timing is critical because Iran has actually achieved nuclear breakout capacity, meaning that if they put their mind to it, they could build nuclear weapon within a month. In fact, they could build 5 nuclear weapons within a month if they wanted to. And they're also very good at building missiles in Iran, so no one has any reason to think that they would not be able to build a deliverable nuclear weapon in a relatively short period of time. And this has been a major change in the region. The U.S. and Israel, under multiple administrations for many decades, have asserted that Iran would never be able to get a nuclear weapon. It's been a red line. But the United States is extremely reluctant to enforce that red line for reasons that are widely known. In particular, the U.S. has had bad experiences with wars recently in the Middle East and South Asia. Also, the U.S. is reluctant to get embroiled in a Middle Eastern conflict again, because that would present a window of opportunity for Russia and China to expand their attempts to change the global order. And that's, of course, what happened when the U.S. was bogged down in Iraq. So the U.S. has been extremely reluctant to enforce this red line and instead has been pursuing a policy of engagement with Iran. Or you could say that U.S. policy has simply been schizophrenic because the U.S. is deeply polarized. And when the Obama administration negotiated the 2015 nuclear deal, freezing Iran's program and lifting sanctions, the Trump administration then promptly revoked that deal. And then the Biden administration tried to put it together again and failed. So we have today sort of a non-solution, an absence of solutions with Iran. The Biden administration was still trying to find some way to engage, even to the point that they had agreed to a prisoner swap and a transfer of $6 billion just a month or two ago, prior to these attacks. Now, because Iran is achieving nuclear weapons gradually, this has caused a shift in the region where countries are starting to form their own balance of power coalition, a coalition to contain Iran, contain their conventional military influence as well as their sort of militant proxies, their hybrid capabilities. and ultimately a nuclear Iran. And the United States is sort of trying to help build this balance of power coalition precisely because the US doesn't really want to enforce the red line. And so that means cultivating what would someday be an Abraham alliance, stemming from the Abraham Accords, and it would involve the Arab states recognizing Israel. And this was really starting to gain traction, particularly negotiations between Saudi Arabia and Israel toward having Saudis recognize Israel. And the U.S. was trying to orchestrate a really big deal in which the U.S. would give the Saudis security guarantees, but the Saudis would have to recognize Israel and give Israel security guarantees. And then there'd be an interlocking set of guarantees and security cooperation, which would build trust between the Israelis and the Arab states. If Saudi Arabia can do it, then the entire Arab world can follow. And Iran would then, there'd be a mechanism to contain Iran. So there were several actors that obviously opposed this process. First of all, Iran did not want to see Arabs and Jews form an alliance against Iran. Second of all, Hamas. Hamas, remember, is dedicated to, well, annihilating the Jewish state, but also more locally, they did not want to see a two-state solution or any kind of settlement of the Palestinian territories that would be negotiated between Israel and Saudi Arabia rather than between Israel and the Palestinians, and particularly Hamas. So Hamas has an individual interest in preventing the Israeli-Saudi rapprochement, but also Iran backs Hamas and provides support through Hezbollah and other means, and effectively had an interest in preventing this balance of power coalition from forming. So where we are today is that the Israelis they'll stage a major, obviously they will punish Hamas for doing what it's done, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that he wants to eliminate the warfighting capability of Hamas. So that's going to be a major ground incursion in Gaza Strip. And then we have to talk about what the Israelis might do after that. But for now, what's clear is that they'll be deeply engaged in a major offensive in Gaza, which raises a couple of questions. First, will Hezbollah in Lebanon intervene and attack from the north while this is happening? That's possible. If Iran is planning a multi-front war against Israel, then that's what you should expect. We're not so sure because, of course, Hezbollah did not intervene on Saturday when Hamas did. So if the plan was to attack Israel at the same time, that's not what happened. So it seems as if Hezbollah is holding back and Iran is holding back. And in that case, either Hamas acted alone or Iran is not yet willing to activate all of its militant proxies. But the Israelis will go forward in Gaza, and then after that, there will be a question as to whether they are satisfied that they have done what they can do, whether they can shift to diplomacy after that, or whether they would then believe that they need to take further actions. And I think that generally speaking, the financial markets are probably underrating the risk that Israel goes beyond Gaza, that Israel then starts to, they're looking at their own domestic security. They're not safe. They thought that they were safe from anything remotely like, forces penetrating the wall from Gaza. So now they're going to take a very hard look at Hezbollah and the north. And that means that they could intervene up there, particularly because what the United States is telling them is we cannot go after the root of the problem, Iran. And part of that is because the Biden administration wants to engage with Iran. Part of it is that Biden does not want to instigate an oil shock by attacking and confronting Iran prior to the election. So if Israel's looking at its options, it can't really go after Iran alone. It could, but it would be extremely risky, particularly given that they've just been shown to be vulnerable at home. Maybe the only avenue for Israel next is to go after Hezbollah in Lebanon. So I think what we have to watch going forward is, first of all, whether the Israelis are satisfied with the campaign in Gaza or whether they go beyond that. Second of all, can the U.S. and Israel agree on how culpable Iran is? Probably not. because the U.S. again has an election interest that it doesn't really want to confront Iran right now. And then finally, could Israel confront Iran anyway? And they could do that through multiple ways. But one is that if they do go after Hezbollah, that could then, if they're successful, that could then force the Iranians to intervene, and we could end up with a regional conflict, regardless of what the Biden administration wants. So the bottom line here is that the region is extremely unstable as it has been. And I'll leave it at that. And let me just say one other thing. For past 2 years, and you all probably remember, speaking with Stephen and you all and other groups, I have emphasized that the most underrated geopolitical risk was the Middle East. And the reason is fundamental, and it stems from this transition where Iran has they're very close to being able to obtain nuclear weapons. They have the backing of Russia and China. And so now is when we will see big rumbling in the Middle East, because all the other actors have to decide whether they're going to sort of allow that to happen. Traditionally, states go nuclear and other states simply accommodate them because they don't really have much of a choice. And that's what happened with North Korea. But in this case, Israel may believe it has a choice. Israel may believe it can rope the Americans into it. And also, Israel now has a lot of political capital because they've just suffered a horrific attack. So I think we need to not be complacent about the fact that Israel doesn't produce oil or Lebanon doesn't produce oil. We will see a risk premium in oil prices, and that's because this is ultimately a regional conflict, and it does ultimately suggest that we will have a larger confrontation at some point with Iran.
Apart from the Middle East, there's clearly a lot going on in some other parts of the world. So we wanted to get your thoughts on uh, the war in Ukraine, the ongoing war in Ukraine, and how these latest developments in the Middle East might play into that. What Russia's mindset might be, and then closer to your home, uh, you know, believe it or not, we're gearing up for the 2024 presidential election. And if you believe the opinion polls, it's going to be a Trump versus Biden, race. Um, so what can we expect over the next year? And really, if Trump does win the presidency, what might the world look like after that?
Right,
So
right.
maybe start with Europe, with the war in Ukraine, Russia,
Yeah,
Europe, and then perhaps into the US.
yeah, absolutely. Well, so first of all, Ukraine, as we have seen, the counteroffensive this year was not wildly successful, and most of the uh, military analysts looking at the counteroffensive were not overly optimistic ahead of time. But what we have seen thus far is that the Ukrainians have not been able to move the line, the battle line, the line of control in a major way. And that's probably going to still be the case a month from now, when it starts to become a month and a half at the most is a period where, winter sets in and it becomes even more difficult to conduct operations. So we're probably not going to see any game changers on the battlefield at this stage. If you remember my views previously, I sort of wanted to allow as much room in the fall for the Ukrainians to make a strategic breakthrough. But at this point, it's looking quite unlikely. Maybe at most you could give them maybe a 1/3 chance of making some kind of breakthrough over the next month. So if that's true, then that means that the war is losing relevance from a long-term point of view already, because the peak momentum that the Ukrainians would have had would be this fall in this counteroffensive. Going forward, the problem is they start to lose support from the United States and from Europe, particularly Europe, where we're already slipping into a recession, and so the public's will have energy price spikes as well. So the public will be reluctant to continue bankrolling Ukraine, and that's been vividly illustrated by the fact that Slovakia just elected a leader who is less supportive of Ukraine, and we also saw in Poland in the elections that there was this dispute over Ukraine. And if those two countries are losing their appetite to support Ukraine, then of course others will. But also we saw in the United States how the Republicans have been agitating to reduce funding for Ukraine. So all of these things sort of suggest that Ukraine will not be getting as much support in the future, and so their momentum will be reduced. And yet they were unable to make a strategic breakthrough here when they had the most momentum. So now what happens is we enter into a very delicate period because President Putin will have an election in March. He will want to sort of recapitalize. He'll sort of be able to claim mission accomplished because he'll still have the annexed territories. And he'll look to get popular support in the election. And, he probably won't have to steal the election in a context where basically he's succeeded in taking these territories from Ukraine. After that, we then will, I think, see a pivot from Putin because he needs to start focusing on domestic stability because the ruble has collapsed. They're going to have high inflation. They're isolated. They're suffering from sanctions. And productivity in this economy was extremely weak even prior to the war. So for those out there who are saying, the sanctions didn't affect Russia, well, that view is very short-sighted. Over the long run, it is very dismal outlook for this shrinking population and low productivity economy. So that's threatening for Putin, and he's going to have to start addressing the home front. But ultimately, he's got a better deal if he can get the Republicans into office in the U.S. than if not. And his strategy is very clear. We predicted it, and it's happening. So I have higher conviction even than I did, which is that he's cutting energy supply. So he's going to continue doing what he was doing, weaponizing energy. Cutting the oil supply can push up the price, and it can then push up the price of gasoline at the pump. And when we get above $4 per gallon in the U.S., that really starts to weigh on the likelihood of the incumbent party winning the election. It doesn't solve the problem for Russia, but it does reduce the odds marginally of Democrats winning. Now, that only works if Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states are cooperative, if OPEC 2.0 coalition is functional. And so far, that's been true this year. So far, that was our view as well. Now, though, I'm starting to lose confidence in that OPEC 2.0 structure because, first of all, as global demand falls, there will be more pressure to sort of for each country to fend for itself in terms of how much revenue they can make. But the other thing that we see is that the United States could take a different approach to Saudi Arabia after the Hamas attacks. Because if you look at it, the U.S. has been trying very hard to engage with Iran, but now they know that Iran is really looking to go on the offense. And that could create an environment where the U.S. basically goes to Saudi Arabia and says, okay, we'll give you a lot more weapons and you can give us a little bit more oil. And that would be a short-term deal. It wouldn't be like the deal we talked about earlier with Israel, because that's sort of on ice now. But it would be a deal in which the Saudis might start cooperating with the U.S. more. And so from that perspective, if the Saudis start producing oil, the Russians will lose their ability to control the oil price through any kind of embargo next year. And that would sort of neutralize Russia's weaponization of oil with regard to the U.S. election. However, if Biden does not recognize this, if he doesn't give the Saudis a great deal, if he can't convince them, or if we end up with a conflict with Iran, then we'll still have this oil shock environment. Because think about it, even if the Saudis are pumping more oil, if there's a conflict with Iran stemming from Israel and the nuclear program, the Iranians can destroy more oil capacity faster than the spare capacity in the world can fill that gap. So let's try to simplify all of this, because it gets quite complicated. But let's just say the Russians are cutting oil production. It has pushed up the oil price because Saudis and others are cooperating. So we end up with these higher energy prices, and that will be the case going into 2024. The only thing that can change that is if Biden does a deal with the Saudis. And you'll know because the Saudis will sort of announce that they're not cutting production anymore, or that they're increasing production. And so that will be a big effect. And then finally, with regard to the actual settlement in Ukraine, like a ceasefire, I can see two scenarios at this point. One is that we get one between the result of the U.S. election and Inauguration Day. The other is that it has to be sort of after the inauguration, and it sort of depends on the outcomes there. but we're probably still a way off from a ceasefire. At earliest, a ceasefire could come, in the coming months. But the Biden administration cannot trust Russia. Like, imagine if Biden abandons Ukraine and tries to negotiate with Russia. Well, Russia can still cut the oil production, and then Biden has a bad election. So Biden instead will double down on Ukraine, and that makes it unlikely that we get a ceasefire until after the election or sometime in 2025. But the overall outline of that ceasefire is clear from what we already talked about. Russia has effectively annexed those territories in southern Ukraine. Russia can't really invade more territory. Ukraine can't really take it back. It's sort of locked in place. But from an investment point of view, what matters is whether OPEC 2.0 continues to squeeze the oil supply and whether that leads to an oil shock next year.
Thanks, Matt. Just on that, do you think Ukraine would be willing to, give up that territory that Russia seems to have gained, for a
No,
peace deal? No.
no, not at all. But I mean, it's just that's that territory was taken from them by force, and they have not been able to take it back by force. And the U.S. and the other countries are not willing to put boots on the ground and give them reinforcements and troops. So, and that's not going to change. So, with no one else willing to put boots on the ground, Ukraine is stuck trying to fight a war where they're outnumbered 5-1. They're using Western weaponry, which has been very effective, but they can't learn overnight how to use tanks and conduct combined operations. They don't have air superiority. Biden will probably give them jets and start to train their pilots. But I mean, these guys are going to have to learn how to fly F-16s and fly them in a supposedly combined arms operation a year from now, which is a pretty daunting task. And maybe it will work, maybe let's put it this way: the spring of 2025, if Biden is reelected, you could probably see a pretty significant Ukrainian counteroffensive. And that's one of the major reasons why Russia is likely to continue trying to cut off the oil supply, because they really want to change the ruling party in the United States and try to get a negotiation going rather than face a new Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2025 with potentially air superiority.
So it sounds like you're thinking that the Russians may keep going until after the November 2024 election, on the view that, the Republican Party, i.e., most likely Trump, might be back in power.
I think that we've got to think about scenarios, and I'll tell you what my scenarios were 6 months ago, and then we can sort of compare how reality has shifted. So what I've been saying is that the absolute earliest for a ceasefire is this November, like next month. And that's because I argued that there was probably a 2/3 chance it would be a stalemate on the ground, which would mean that by wintertime, effectively all players could decide to do a ceasefire. And I always said that was the lowest probability, but the earliest date. And I guess in some way, that could still happen. Probably not. But I would then move that to next spring. I'd say that maybe the earliest we could get is after the Russian election in April or May next year, if the two sides simply do not want to expend the resources to fight another summer campaign. They may agree to a ceasefire. And people may tell me I'm bonkers, but I've studied a lot of wars, and sometimes that's the way it happens, particularly because ceasefires come and go. You can have a ceasefire next spring and then it can fall apart next fall. So ceasefire by next spring is possible. But if we're looking for a more lasting ceasefire, that's where I would say you've got to see the result of the U.S. election, because here you've got Trump saying that he'll hold support for the Ukrainians and conclude the war on day one, and Putin would love that. So obviously, Putin has an incentive to hold out, and if he does a ceasefire prior to that, it's simply to save resources. It's not the real ceasefire. I think in the end, there's a strong incentive for Putin to cut oil production and try to derail the Biden administration.
Mm. But let's. I was going to go to the U.S. election now, and we've actually got a question from one of our colleagues specifically relating to this. So, the question is, Trump's approval ratings look very high, for Republican voters, but there's a proportion of Americans who are never going to vote for him. And Biden's approval ratings look pretty poor, well, very poor. So should we expect that they'll be the candidates, or is there a possibility of another candidate in either party coming through, and or a independent in the election? Which I just note, the nephew of JFK has just put his hand up as an independent, right?
Yeah.
But
There's a
I was
whole.
going to say that he is, aligned with what JFK might have been aligned with would be wrong, right? Not so much, right? Yeah. So
No,
maybe some
but
details around him as well.
well, he's got huge name recognition. I can tell you the fact that he's got Kennedy as a last name is the reason why he's polling second to Biden in the Democratic Party, above the Vice President Kamala Harris.
Yeah.
So there you go. So if he runs as an independent, that will subtract some votes from Democrats, because there are groups of Democrats who are disaffected with the current establishment and but yet they don't want to vote Republican. They're Democrats, right? And they might vote for a Kennedy who's sort of anti-establishment and has different views. They might not have liked all that COVID social restriction, and that's been one area where JFK Jr. has been, Robert Kennedy has been sort of, really flogging the horse. So
yeah.
So yes, so let's break this down. Let's be very systematic, because you're going to hear so much commentary about the US election, and it's very important to have our parameters. First of all, sitting president is reelected 67% of the time. Second of all, the ruling party is reelected with an incumbent party elected 56% of the time in an election like this, where you're in the middle of a cycle. So Biden is favored heavily, and that's why the Democrats keep supporting him, and that's why he has a 40 percentage point lead over Kennedy in the Democratic Party polling. That's not a polling error. That's a 40 percentage point lead. So Biden is heavily favored. It doesn't matter about his age and the fact that he misspeaks frequently. He was very old and misspoken back in 2020, but he was still the figurehead for the party, and that's where we are today. So that's why you see that continual support for him. It would just unnecessarily reduce the Democrats' odds of winning if they just arbitrarily changed. The sitting president is the most likely person to be reelected president. If he gets sick or falls down, if there's a real physical incapacitation, then he steps down. If his approval rating collapses beneath, say, 35%, he steps down, right? Why would that happen? Probably recession would cause that. In those cases, if there's no recession, then in fact, the Democrats would still be favored. Like I said, 56% incumbent party reelection rate. If there's a recession, their odds fall historically to between 20 and 33%. So really, it's going to boil down to the unemployment rate. And when I say recession, I'm not talking about the NBER designated recessions, because I can promise you that the NBER is not going to call it a recession until November 6th of 2024. But what would happen is the unemployment rate would go up, and that means that voters are unhappy, and that means they kick out the ruling party. So if the unemployment rate is above 4.5%, that's going to very heavily weigh on Democratic odds of re-election. Biden will be the candidate unless he's incapacitated. If he's removed, it will definitely be Kamala Harris. Don't listen to what other people tell you. It doesn't matter that Kamala Harris doesn't poll that well. And if they had a competitive nomination process in which they let all the skeletons out of the closet to compete with Kamala Harris, all they would do is divide the Democratic Party and make it less likely that they would win the general election. So in fact, they will rally around the existing ticket, Biden-Harris. It's already won once. It's more likely than anything else to win again. And by the way, speaking of Kamala Harris, because this is important, people say, oh, she's not very well liked. Well, no, but neither is Trump. Neither is Biden. These are all unfavorable people based on the opinion polls. But Kamala Harris is not as disliked as the others. She's not as disliked as Hillary Clinton. And we're in a post-Roe v. Wade environment. Remember, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, which was the federal right to an abortion. So women have been kind of swinging behind the Democratic Party. Kamala Harris would actually capture that. So in other words, the first woman president bid failed in 2016 But it didn't fail because having the first woman president was a bad electoral strategy. No, it failed because Hillary Clinton was a bad candidate. But if you put a less bad candidate in a post Roe v. Wade environment to be the first woman and first woman minority president, in fact, it would be a decent electoral strategy. So, in other words, it's Biden or it's Harris. And if there's a recession, they both lose. It doesn't matter. Now, with Trump, and I'll try to be quicker here, with Trump, he has full support of the party. He's got a 35 percentage point lead over his rivals. It's very clear that he's going to be the candidate. He also is polling neck and neck with Biden, and in many polls, he's beating Biden. So you can't even tell Republicans you shouldn't vote for Trump because he's got all this baggage, because it's manifestly the case that he's competitive. So if he's tied in head-to-head polls, Republicans are not irrational for voting for him, because apparently he is competitive, and they are voting for him anyway. Now, if the Republican Party tried to get rid of him, he could run as a third-party candidate, and Democrats would definitely win. So Republicans have to accept him. And then finally, only if he's in jail, because when he's in jail, the dynamic changes. When he's in jail, he has a personal private interest in endorsing a different candidate who can win the election and give him a pardon. So I can see some small probability scenario where he's sentenced to prison before the election. But if that happens, then the Republican Party would nominate probably Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, who is the sort of non-Trump Trump. And then Trump would actually endorse DeSantis, because his choice is either go to jail or have someone else give you a pardon. And legally, he could run from jail, but the fact is he probably wouldn't win. So when we put all that together, what does it tell us? And this is just a conclusion here on the U.S. The market is too concerned about the individuals. Biden could die of a heart attack. Trump could go to jail. The truth is that the major parties are coalescing on a consensus, a policy consensus. If you saw, President Biden is actually building a wall on the southern border. He co-opted Trump's wall. He co-opted Trump's China tariffs and escalated the China trade war. He passed a bipartisan infrastructure package, and Trump was always touting infrastructure, as was Obama. And he also has been supporting U.S. manufacturing and if not reshoring, at least offshoring away from China. So basically, the Biden administration has co-opted Trump's strategy, and investors have a very clear view now that, Republican or Democrat, we have a return of government, large spending, large budget deficits, restricting immigration, raising the general tariff level, promoting domestic manufacturing. Those things are across the board, and promoting infrastructure. Finally, foreign policy. That's where you see a real difference. First of all, that's why the president actually matters. And second of all, Trump would be much more unorthodox and erratic and risky. Tail risks would be higher under Trump. And I think for countries like Australia, that's a really significant concern, is that Trump could be punitive toward allies as well as enemies, whereas Biden is going to be very accommodative toward allies, and he'll pursue at least a predictable approach toward enemies.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask then about the implications for the US-China relationship, which you've touched on there, but it sounds like similar starting point, but Trump could move it further, more aggressively anti-China, tariffs, etc.
Yeah, I think so. And having said that, we know that Biden's policy is very aggressive against China, right? Because he's trying to build a coalition of multiple nations to constrain their access to high tech. And so, in other words, China might even prefer Trump, because Biden is more effective at building that coalition.
Mm.
If the real fear for China is an effective, watertight containment of the semiconductor access and containment of high tech, well, Biden is actually more effective because he's more likely to get the Japanese and the Dutch and the South Koreans and everybody on board. So Trump, will probably pursue the same strategy, but he may not be as good building a coalition, and then in that case, China would be able to circumvent the restrictions. So basically, bottom line is Trump brings different risks, but they're both hawkish on China. And I think that's why we see that China has to be indifferent. They can't really predict the outcome. They can't really affect the outcome too much. And in fact, it's very clear Republicans and Democrats are all sort of on the same page now about being protectionist and hawkish when it comes to China.
We've got about 10, 15 minutes to go, so I'm going to actually start going to some of the questions that have been popped into the chat, and not surprisingly, quite a few of them relate to, again, the situation in the Middle East. So the first one, do you think Russia was aware of the terrorist attacks being planned on Israel? And if they were aware, do you think they would have given it the tick of approval?
So I think this is a case of alignment of interest. And I've argued all along that the Russians had a huge incentive in throwing Molotov cocktails into the Middle East. So from a point of view of interest, the Russians benefit. But from the point of view of operations, I don't think they were involved. This was the operational security of this campaign was incredible. I mean, Hamas was able to evade Israeli intelligence on a massive attack that involved coordination land, sea, and air at 20 different checkpoints they overran, or 20 different breaches in the wall. Basically, you can't go around talking about this kind of operation. The secret will get spilled. So I don't think anyone knew about it, really. And in fact, that's even one reason for thinking that maybe Hezbollah and Iran were not directly orchestrating it. Iran has provided enormous support for Hamas. Hezbollah has provided enormous support for Hamas. But were they really talking on the phone about this operation? I don't know, but it would have been more likely to be intercepted if they were. So the bottom line is Hamas is the one party that, with the backing of Iran and Hezbollah that they've had, and with their own internal interest and operational security, could have kept this a secret. And notice that Hezbollah did not intervene at the same time. So it is possible that Hamas acted alone. In the end, we may never know. In the end, Iran is definitely implicated to some extent. But I don't think the Russians knew per se. I think, in fact, Russia will do other things to make sure they fan the flames of unrest in the Middle East. And in particular, if Russia, just in 8 days, the missile restrictions on Iran will expire at the United Nations, and Iran will be able to sell ballistic missiles to Russia to use in Ukraine, and Russia and China will be able to provide Iran with parts to build missiles. And if Iran and Russia do a deal, maybe Russia can help them with their missile defense capabilities in case the US or Israel try to attack them. So I think Russia will sow unrest and instability in the region and try to push up the oil price that way. But I don't think they were privy specifically to what Hamas was doing.
Right, yeah. So another question about the situation there. So paraphrasing, Hamas and Iran would have known that there was going to be a aggressive retaliation from Israel. So the question is, what are the chances that the Israeli response is so strong and the loss of Muslim life is so high that the Arab alliance actually strengthens against Israel and potentially the US?
I don't think so. I think that maybe Hamas imagines that it could work that way. But the problem is there's a few issues here. So first of all, it's definitely true at a certain level. Like Israel going in and just pounding Gaza will generate negative sentiment toward Israel. It will wipe away the sympathy that they got, and it will then start to generate negative, particularly in Arab countries. And that's the key here, is that Hamas did not want Israel and Saudi Arabia to form that security pact or normalization. They didn't want Saudi to recognize. And it's probably true that Saudi will delay that because the popular opinion won't support it. And so in that sense, it's true. But with respect to the idea that we sort of go back to a previous era where, remember when Egypt and Syria were allied against Israel, for example. I don't think we're going back to any of that. What's happened is that the states in this region, they don't really care about the Palestinians much. None of them are taking care of the Palestinians. None of them are really trying to help the Palestinians very much. Their issue is that they're running their own countries with their own interests, and their biggest threat now is Iranian domination. And so that's why we see UAE normalize relations with Israel. That's why we see Bahrain normalize relations with Israel. And in fact, everyone is willing to work with Israel simply because they have a shared security interest, not because they've changed their opinion on Judaism. And that's the status quo we have. And so, in other words, if you fast forward a few years, it's still fairly likely that Saudi Arabia and Israel will increase security cooperation. And at some point, Saudis probably will recognize Israel. But for now, that's put on hold. I think what they'll do is they'll do security cooperation, but they won't recognize it. It'll just be covert. And I think the Americans won't give Saudi Arabia, a true security guarantee, but they will sell them a lot of weapons and give them technology and do other things to try to make sure they stay on the same side. And so that's the world that we'll be in, which is really not all that different from the world that we've been in. The change is that Iran got nuclear weapons, and so the change is that the other countries in the region are trying to contain Iran.
I'm just going to go through a couple more questions in the time we've got, but one more on the situation there. Well, actually, someone's written that your comments suggest that the tensions in the Middle East and the situation in Ukraine, Russia are likely, so the tensions of volatility is likely to increase over the next 6 to 12 months. So they're asking, is that correct? Is that your assessment? Things are going to get worse? And if that's the case, is there a chance that actually could bring the US and China closer together as they try and de-escalate some of those risks?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So to be very clear about my views on these issues, first, yes, tensions are going up everywhere. The main reason is that the US election is enormously important. There's going to be some serious winners and serious losers if this populist America First strategy succeeds. Because remember, if Trump wins, it's not just Trump for 4 years. It's also the fact that the populist coalition electoral strategy worked, which means that future Republicans, like in 2028, will continue with that strategy. That's a very different world that we live in, as opposed to a world where Trump loses, so his electoral strategy has lost twice, which means that the Republican Party now shifts back to the center and tries to win power by being more moderate. That's an extremely different outlook for the world. And there's big winners and losers, and Iran is one of the big losers if this populist thing happens. And there's others as well. Ukraine is a loser. So in other words, the US election is exporting global uncertainty. Allies do not want Trump to pull the rug out from under them. Enemies do not want Trump to concentrate the enormous power of the United States against them. And also there's situations like China, where China doesn't want Biden to succeed because he can build a coalition against China, or Russia doesn't want Biden to succeed because he can build a coalition with Europe against Russia. So there's the high stakes are stemming from the US, but then there's also other things. Again, Iran is, I said earlier, they've achieved nuclear weapons. They're on the brink of achieving nuclear weapons. That's a big change. There's a US election. The end game of Ukraine is also over the next 12 or 24 months. None of us know exactly when it's going to end, but we know that with a stalemate on the battlefield, that the end game is approaching. And so the final machinations are gearing up. So we're reaching a climax there. We're reaching a climax on all these fronts. And I haven't even talked about the Taiwanese election on January 13th, which is another major climactic event. So I'm just saying we're witnessing a confluence of factors that are risk factors. And in the end, maybe 2025 will be a great year, and we'll find out that the US and China stepped back from the brink, the US and Russia stepped back from the brink, and the US and Iran stepped back. Maybe it'll just all be peace and prosperity. But what I'm telling you is that there's so much enormous uncertainty between now and then. you don't want to sort of blithely go into this cycle thinking that everything's going to be okay.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe just in the final minutes, we might bring it back a little bit to Australia. So, as you would have seen, there's been some thawing in relationship between Australia and China. The Prime Minister's been invited to go up there before the end of the year. Some of the tariffs are being lifted. So, just some quick thoughts on that. And then also Australia's, involvement in these, big geopolitical issues in terms of AUKUS with the US and the UK, the Quad. How do you see us fitting into this very uncertain world?
Yes. Well, so first of all, from a geopolitical point of view, Australia definitely has to be extremely wary of any power that can create an Asian empire. And that goes back to the same strategic imperatives that existed in World War II when Japan was threatening to build the East Asia co-prosperity sphere. And the Americans are, of course, the great friend of Australia in that regard, because they can help to protect Australia from an Asian hegemon. And the U.S. needs a partner in Asia for that same purpose. So there is a bedrock alliance there. And I don't say that in a diplomatic sense, but I think when the diplomats say that, it is actually true based on the interests. But the China situation is complex because of the economic integration that China was able to achieve over the past 40 years, which is, of course, extremely important for Australia. And the bottom line is that most U.S. allies, particularly in Asia, have a huge economic exposure to China. So they don't need the U.S. to come and deliberately create fires, because that will be harmful for their own domestic economic interests and political stability. At the same time, they do want the U.S. to come in and help provide them with security. So if the Asian states and Australia, others, if they're given conventional American policy, which is willing to use deterrence to maintain the strategic status quo in the region, post 1945, post 1952 strategic status quo, then that's the best scenario for these states, because you can continue to trade with China. You just have to restrict that trade in any areas that that grossly affect national security. You have to sort of remove some influence operations. But Australia is well on the way to responding to these risks. And now that they're out in the open, everyone knows about them. And so it's not as if Australia is not responding to China, but Australia doesn't necessarily need to go instantly to trade zero with China and Cold War. So and even the U.S. is applying the same approach. I mean, you have the Biden administration doing the same thing that Prime Minister Albanese is doing, which is trying to engage, but also trying to fortify the security front. And I think that status quo can last for a very long time. What changes it is if China does something aggressive, particularly toward Taiwan. At that point, it's Cold War, and maybe not trade zero, but pretty close. Or maybe the Americans maybe the Americans elect someone who's reckless and doesn't really understand some of these post-World War II dynamics and does not adequately manage the stability and the security of the region. And that could be, for example, if President Trump, he could do either. He could either be too aggressive and provoke China, or he could be so disengaged and isolationist that he sort of invites China to take a more aggressive and larger role in the region. And either of those tail risks would be destabilizing. So I think for Australia, it's very clear that the Trump administration is a huge risk. And I was just talking to some friends, clients in South Korea, and I gave them the same advice. And the reason is because U.S. allies are exposed to Trump-style policy because it's punitive toward allies as well as enemies. He could pass trade sanctions that affect allies as well as China. Or he could withdraw troops because of an isolationist claim. One thing Trump says he wants to do is take troops from abroad and put them on the border with Mexico. Well, that creates a power vacuum in those regions, whether it's Germany or Australia or wherever that would happen. It creates a power vacuum, and that power vacuum can be destabilizing. It definitely increases risks, tail risks. So, bottom line, I think insofar as the Trump administration is still constrained by the Republican Party and the instruments of the U.S. bureaucracy, the U.S. is going after China, and the U.S. is going to be pretty closely linked with Australia and Japan and others. And the U.S. is going to be trying to build that balance of power coalition, which includes AUKUS and the Quad. So I actually don't think those things will change under Trump. They could, they will be under greater risk, but I don't really think that's the primary moving part. I think the moving part is more like the Middle East, where Trump has a totally different view on Iran than Biden does, or Ukraine, where Trump would just withdraw support, Biden would double down and give him F-16s. So those are binary outcomes. Mexico, Biden's building a wall on the border with Mexico, but he's not going to deploy U.S. military forces extensively on the border with Mexico, whereas Trump says he would. So basically, Asia is the one area where they kind of agree, and hopefully that does actually provide some security for Australia.
All right, that's been fascinating, mate. We're going to have to finish it there because we're running out of time. But like an amazing tour de force around the world, and it just certainly does seem like the uncertainty is going to be with us for quite a long time to come. Some major moving parts happening here in the world, and obviously, as you said, not only the U.S. election, but elections in Taiwan and a few other places in the next year or so, really going to be very critical. So thanks very much again for your time. I hope everybody on the line, appreciated that and got some good information out of it. I was going to say enjoyed, but maybe that's not the right word. But we really do appreciate your time and your expertise. And thanks very much again.
Thank you, Stephen. I really appreciate it, and I'm always happy to answer follow-up questions. So don't be shy.
All right, great. Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody. Thanks, Matt. Thanks very
Bye-bye.
much for joining. Cheers.